Hi. Probably the first thing that I sort of wanted to have a bit of a talk about today was to try and think a little bit about how the Sustainable Development goals and agenda sort of align within the climate change regime. And it sort of seems to be a theme that's coming across within all the presentations, that the Sustainable Development agenda kind of just aligns and confirms existing priorities, for example, within public health and other regimes, but it's not necessarily providing a stronger basis for action, unless that's a political basis for action, being the sort of interpretation that I'm sort of taking away from this. But definitely what I've sort of found with my research is that the Sustainable Development Goals are very clearly aligned with the goals of the climate change regime, but it's not providing anything significantly new or different, probably. Okay, so first of all, talking about the Sustainable Development Goals, I've just focused on gender equality. I could have focused on the climate change goal as well, but I've just focused on climate goal 5, because otherwise this presentation would be twice as long. Okay, so up here are the some of the indicators related to the Sustainable Development Goal 5, which is to achieve gender equality and empowerment. So these are the indicators that I've chosen that are relevant in the environmental sphere. There are other indicators that have to do with domestic violence and other issues that women face, but I've just focused on the ones that are relevant in the environmental sphere. So the first and biggest issue really in terms of measuring progress in this area is that we don't have data. We don't have reliable data to measure these progress on gender equality. And that produces problems because we don't know if we're designing policies that are addressing the issues. So, for example, a big issue in the environmental sphere is that women are more vulnerable to natural disasters. And this is based on the idea that pre-disaster, women don't get access to information to prepare themselves and to respond, and that after disaster, women can experience sexual violence in temporary camps and places like that. However, all of this sort of action and policy in this space is based on data that's unreliable, data that's been generated from qualitative interviews and then sort of speculated up. So it produces a lot of issues. So with these indicators that we've got here, we really have a challenge in the terms of that Tier 1 means that we've got reliable data. And so we have reliable data around women's participation and leadership. Tier 2, which is the orange ones, is where we have partial data, but it's not really collected regularly, so we can't rely on it. And this is to do with the split of labour economy, how women use their time, and secondly, about access to information. We have some information on that. A really important issue that we do not have any information on, which is considered to be Tier 3 data, is data about women's rights to assets and women's rights to land and property. And that's really important information, particularly in the environmental sphere, because property rights essentially generate your right to benefit or income from the land. So up here I've just got a couple of different slides that really come from UN Women because they're better at creating visual representations than a law academic. But essentially what they're sort of talking about here is just visually communicating some of these ideas around gender equality. And so if we're sort of looking here at one of the probably the next big battles in gender equality is really about how time is used and unpaid care and domestic work. So women spend 3 times more than men generally in carrying out unpaid work. Which then prevents them from taking on other opportunities such as political leadership or other options like that as well. Secondly, then when we sort of come to women in leadership, has anyone been following the Australian politics this week or the last few weeks? For visitors to our country, we have a particularly interesting system here where we change our Prime Minister and leader of the country fairly regularly. And we've got our former deputy making some fairly clear comments about lack of basically treating women well within her party at the moment. She's sort of resigned to the backbench, but we're sort of seeing that even in a country like Australia. So we essentially have around less than a quarter, so about 23.4% of women in positions of sort of sitting within parliaments around the world, and it's about a third when we sort of move to the corporate sector. So there is work to be done there. And then the next slide is really just so showing that we really don't have good data to rely upon. And without good data, we can't make progress because we don't know if we're creating the right kind of policies in this sort of space. So really we need to be able to enhance our data, and that is a really difficult job. So for example, if we want to talk about enhancing data on do women have access or rights to own land, we've got to get across all of the different legal systems in the world to say How is property registered? How is it recorded? Can it be held? What rights attached to that? Which can then occur, at the national level, at the state level, at local levels, according to customary law. So it's incredibly complicated to try and start gathering those sorts of data. Okay, so against that kind of backdrop of what the Sustainable Development Goals is sort of trying to do, what I'm talking about today is a mechanism that exists within the climate change regime, and it's a mechanism that has to do with forest conservation. And it does have gendered impacts because women that are in poor countries have a huge reliance upon forest resources for basically local livelihoods and income generating activities. And I'm focusing on benefit sharing because I'm sort of coming in from the environment and climate sphere into the IP sphere here today. But what I'll just do now is just play a short video which sort of says what REDD+ is, because it's probably worth a short introduction if you haven't come across it before.
REDD is a new international framework to help stop deforestation. It stands for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation in Developing Countries. Why do we need REDD? Because destroying tropical forests releases more carbon dioxide than the entire global transport sector. Without a solution to deforestation, there won't be a solution to climate change. Tropical forests also sustain half of all life on Earth and generate vital services for the planet, such as producing rainfall and cooling the land surface. And 1.4 billion of the world's poorest people also depend on these forests for their survival. How will REDD work? As well as reducing their own carbon dioxide emissions, under REDD, industrialized countries will pay developing nations to keep their forests standing. Until now, forests have only had economic value when cut for their wood or cleared for their land. An area of tropical forest the size of a football pitch is destroyed every 4 seconds. Increasingly, this is to satisfy global demand for products like timber, beef, soy, and palm oil. So who gets paid under REDD? Countries that reduce emissions from deforestation, plus countries that continue to conserve large areas of intact forest, countries that plant new trees, and countries that only use their forests sustainably. When will REDD begin? Officially after 2012, if a new international climate treaty includes REDD. But we cannot afford to wait, because once lost, these forests will be gone, forever. And how much will it cost? That's a billion-dollar question. To halve deforestation by 2020, financing for REDD will need to scale up to an estimated $38 billion a year. But doing nothing is a $1 trillion disaster every year. So how will REDD work? It will take more than just money. Many different stakeholders, from local farmers to national governments, will need to cooperate for REDD to be effective. REDD will only work if the needs and rights of Indigenous people and local communities are respected. If governance is strengthened to ensure that payments don't end up in the wrong hands, and if monitoring systems are put in place to ensure that emissions reductions are real and permanent. So what next? Business as usual is not an option. Forest destruction is accelerating climate change and damaging the Earth's life support system. REDD may be the last, best chance to save tropical forests. But to get REDD right, we need to get ready for REDD now.
Okay, great. So in sum, essentially what REDD+ is paying developing countries to keep forests standing on the basis that that will reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. This mechanism has been particularly controversial, particularly with Indigenous groups, because it's being seen as sort of another colonisation of particular spaces. So there has been some issues there because we also have forest areas where Indigenous rights to forests are not secure. They're not currently recognised, and then this program is operating over the top of that and impacting on how they can use forest resources. But the two big things to take away from this that I'm sort of talking about today is firstly that nowhere in any of these mechanisms do we talk about women. So what will be the impact of this international policy on women that are reliant upon forests for their use? And secondly, if we do have money being transferred down to the community level, how are we ensuring that that's getting to men and women and not just men? Because the studies to date suggest that it's only going to men as well. And I'm probably going to have to speed up. Okay, so what we have before REDD is a whole lot of really great research that comes out of India. And it sort of suggests, and it's by a famous researcher, Bina Agarwal, who sort of showed that there are different uses between men and women of forest areas. In sum, what this really means is that women use it for subsistence and men use it for economic purposes. So really, if we're going to come in with a REDD Plus intervention, we need to recognise that it's going to have gendered impacts in the way that it rolls out. The little data that we have today shows that women basically are not being invited along to participating, but if they are being invited along, they're being given the role of coming as a woman to just sit in the room and sort of tick that box. They're not sort of actively participating and being involved in the process. So then we sort of come and say, well, if REDD Plus is going to come and reward us for keeping the forest standing, we're going to make it more economical we're going to reward you to keep the forest standing as opposed to cutting it down to generate revenue for other purposes. How are you going to be rewarded? What is a REDD Plus benefit? And so the lingo around this is quite complicated. It says it basically can be monetary or non-monetary. And non-monetary essentially means that they invest in sort of community infrastructure in some way, a school, a health service or something like that, or perhaps sort of helping to develop a co-op to sort of process products from a forest. However, the legal scholarship in this area has really been concerned with, well, how do you find out who that benefit should flow to? So how do you figure out where that money from the international level, how should we get it down to the community level? And the answer to that has been, well, you look at who owns the property or the tenure rights in that area, and that basically is the way that will let the money flow. Problem with this is that most of the world's forest estate that's at risk of deforestation has unclear tenure rights, and even if there are clear tenure rights, women often don't have legally recognised or enforceable rights to land. So what that means is that REDD Plus money will not flow through to women. So from some studies that sort of existed pre sort of REDD really getting going, what we can sort of see here is that women in sort of a similar initiative that was carried out in India, sort of really what they wanted when we sort of talked about benefit sharing is they wanted individual cash payments to people individually in the households. So not generically to the community level, but payments basically made in consultation at the household level, not at the community level. That's what women felt would give them the most benefit. Okay, so if we sort of talk about how to improve benefit sharing and gender outcomes in REDD Plus, we've essentially got two streams from sort of a legal perspective. Firstly, we're sort of looking at property rights for women. Because forests grow upon land, the rights that attach to land obviously attach to forests. And our existing data shows that women don't have those rights. However, tenure reform is not simple and easy. And REDD Plus is not necessarily the mechanism to address tenure reform because tenure reform goes beyond forests. However, what REDD Plus can do is ensure that any policies it rolls out are consistent with ensuring rights of women and ensuring that women have access to these sort of considerations. At the moment, as I mentioned, there is nothing within the REDD Plus policy that exists to say that we should consider the outcomes of REDD Plus for women or on women. So what this means is there's no trigger to sort of look at how these systems are being designed with women in mind. There is a trigger for Indigenous groups. We then sort of look at participation rights, and this is again where the Sustainable Development Goals sort of back up stuff that already exists within the climate change regime, which says we need to focus on including women participating in these groups. And we have a sort of a gender action plan, which was adopted last year under the Climate Change Convention that again says it's really important to have gender balance, women involved in making decisions. And unless we have women sitting in the room contributing to these decisions, we won't know how these kind of initiatives are going to impact upon them because they're going to be different. Okay, so we've had one study sort of done that sort of went and had a look at, okay, well, what are the tenure arrangements in these countries and what are the impacts for women across 30 different countries? And what was essentially found is that many of these countries basically didn't have legal rights for women to have legal ownership or recognition of rights to land. There was inconsistencies in that generally women were not being recognised or rewarded in these sorts of systems. So really the main thing here is to ensure the lessons that come from this is that we really need to have in the safeguard policy, the REDD+ safeguard policy, a clause that says women need to be considered in there. Secondly, what we need to think about is when we start looking at things like gender balance and participation, so having women in the room, we need to look at the type of participation. So it's not just sort of enough to sort of tick the box and have 2 women sitting in the room if they've got no power to really control or participate and shape the sort of agenda that's moving forward. So that's kind of what we again look at here as being sort of nominal participation. And what we really want to do is move on this table towards more interactive participation. So this is where you sort of have a right to shape the agenda and for your contributions to actually have some impact as opposed to just merely box ticking in that sort of way. So I feel like I've rushed a little bit to try and make sure that I get through on time, but I'll hopefully finish early even. So in summary, what I wanted to say is that in order to make progress on the Sustainable Development Goal 5, we really need more work in respect of gathering data. Because until we get accurate data, we can't make sure that the policies are focused on the right issues. So that's really, something that's really important in this area. UN Women is leading a study on this. However, we're collecting data over a range of topics. We're collecting data over domestic violence, over access to education, over health incomes. So it's going to be an ongoing job. It's also really important to think about gender equality in what I've talked about today, which is sort of the non-traditional sort of female areas that you would think about. So traditionally when we talk about gender equality, we're talking about family law, domestic violence. But it's really important to start thinking about gender beyond those as well. And our early lessons from REDD+ suggest that it's operating in a gender-blind way because there's no trigger within the policies to require for women to be taken into consideration. So this undermines not only REDD+, because it's going to undermine the effectiveness of the program, but it also undermines progress under the Sustainable Development Goals.